Good evening, everybody. Welcome, namaskar. Welcome to another edition, our June edition of Humanity 2.0, these conversations which we've been having with such interesting and intriguing people. When we started this initiative of Humanity 2.0, it was born in 2020 as an event to spotlight authors, artists, thought leaders, and practitioners in one-on-one conversations, which would explore the issues and give us a way to influence public discourse on protecting the poor from violence and other issues that were so connected to justice. The initiative has built visibility and traction through engagements with eminent personalities from different walks of life, the most recent of whom have been C.Y. Gopinath, Veda Varshita, and Shawnee Mukherjee. The Humanity 2.0 initiative actually falls under the larger umbrella of Justice Collective, which was actually started in 2018. And we envisaged this as a blogging platform that would bring together people with like-minded people with a passion and a way of wanting to communicate a message. We also looked at it as a way of facilitating dialogue between people who were either authors, writers, it could have been thought leaders, or even anyone who had a perspective on justice or the lack of it in our society today. For today's conversation, I am so thrilled. And I would ask all those who are on the call with us today to help me welcome an esteemed writer, creator of the Mughal detective Muzaffar Jung, and well-loved historical fiction writer, Madhulika Liddle. Welcome to our show, Madhulika. Thank you so much for making time to be with us. I really look forward to this conversation, which already promises to be something that I'm going to remember for a long time. It's going to go into the history of Humanity 2.0 conversations.
Thank you so much, Prashanti. Thank you for inviting me here. And it's a real privilege for me because I know that, I've seen some of your videos and the sort of questions you've asked people, and it has really mesmerized me. So it's a real honor for me to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
That is so encouraging. Thank you so much for giving me that confidence for this evening's conversation as well. I was really wondering where to start because with several novels and short story anthologies already to your name, you are a well-known storyteller, Madhulika. So to get this conversation started off today, if you were telling your story, how and where would you begin?
I would begin in my early childhood, maybe when I was about 6 years old. I grew up in a home which was full of books. Both my parents are really keen readers, and the home was full of books. And I began reading fairly early, and I began writing fairly early as a result. So I think my first short story was written when I was 6 years old. So I would write little stories and things like that. And over the years, it was just my parents, and my sister who were the recipients of all my writing. So I would write little short stories for them and tell them, okay, read this. So that was how it happened. And it just sort of, I suppose it was sort of organic. So from there it went on. But of course, for a while, I did not even think, that there could be a chance that anybody would want to publish my work. There was first of all, there was a serious lack of confidence. Secondly, this was like, this was in the time when the net was still not there, and the
Right,
blogging was not an option. So if you wanted to be published, you had to go to a publisher, a
right.
proper publisher. And back then, this was, I'm talking about like the late 90s or the early 2000s. Even publishers, Indian publishers, were notoriously finicky about what they wanted published. So they did not want to touch anything which wasn't literary fiction. So things like a detective novel, for instance, was like, nobody wanted to publish detective fiction. So all that sort of stuff. And similarly, also short stories. Even now,
Right.
short stories are not much liked. But fortunately, I managed to get a publisher and Hachette published my first book, which was The Englishman's Cameo, which was a historical detective novel
Right.
starring Muzaffar Jung. And that was what started it all off. And since then I've steadily writing lots of other books.
You have been writing a lot of other books. So I wanted to ask you, you said you were a voracious reader. Who were your favorite authors? Who did you read?
I read lots and lots. But you know what? When I was that small, and in fact, I think well into my 20s, most of the authors I read were British authors. So, you had people like P.T. Woodhouse. I remember P.T.
Yes.
Woodhouse was one of my favorites, and Gerald
Yes.
Darrell, and James
Yes.
Herriot,
Yes.
and Alistair MacLean for a while. So these
Yes.
were my favorites. It was only much later, I think, when I was in my late 20s or so, that I started getting into Indian writing. And even then, for a long time, it was only Ruskin Bond and R.K. Narayan. So it's
Right.
my exploration of Indian writing has only happened in more recent years. But
Right.
early on, it was like I loved the more light-hearted genres. So I loved historical fiction. I loved historical detective fiction specifically.
Right.
Detective fiction as such, and humor, and anything about animals. I am very fond of nature, so
Right. Right.
animals, anything
You
to do
did
with
mention
animals
that.
was yeah. So all sorts of stuff. I had a very eclectic, and I still do. I read just about everything that comes to me.
That's wonderful because I think that's something I can relate to as well. I remember growing up, I think we got books for almost every occasion. My dad was, a firm believer that an education, not just that which we got in school, but which we got, through other reading as well, was the biggest gift that he could give us. And I think he, for every occasion, be it a birthday or was if it was Christmas or any other
Mm.
festival, we would get books. And I mean, the best part is that my dad still buys books for us, but also would appreciate any books that we buy for him. So I understand this whole, the beauty of growing up with books,
Mm.
because I think it takes you to places that you would probably not physically travel to,
Yeah.
but you get to explore so much more because of reading. Thank you for telling us a little bit about your childhood. Um, so, Madhulika, why historical fiction? How did that come about?
I think my first foray into historical fiction was because of the Muzaffar Jung stories. And
Okay.
that actually had its roots in maybe when I was about 13. I read this book called The Chinese Maze Murders. It's by this Dutch diplomat called Robert van Gulik. Now, Robert van Gulik was. He was a Sinophile. So he was posted in China for many years as a diplomat. And while he was there, he got very interested in Chinese detective novels. So apparently the Chinese had this whole tradition of writing detective novels in the 1700s and whatever. And maybe, I think before that as well. And one of the most famous characters in Chinese detective novels was this real life personality called Judge D. He was a
Okay.
magistrate. He was actually a
Okay.
real life personality. But of course, the novels took him and turned him into this hero. And he was, he sort of solved all sorts of fascinating crimes. And Robert Van Gulik decided that this was a very good, that would have a good audience outside of China as well. So what he did was he sort of redid the stories a little bit. He got rid of supernatural elements helping the detective. And he wrote this whole series of books about Judge D. And they're fascinating books. And I read my first Judge D when I was about 13. And I was hooked. I love the idea that this is it's a proper detective story. There's no mugging around this. It's solid as a detective story.
Right.
Yet the way it evokes China, it evokes medieval China so brilliant. He really brings it alive. And that got me hooked. And after that, I read like dozens of I wouldn't say dozens, many more than dozens of other historical detectives from across the world. So, there are
Right.
detectives from England and Wales and Ireland and Rome and Greece and Egypt and all sorts of stuff. And I was, so why is there no Indian historical detective?
Right. That was
And
a
that struck my. I said I had to invent an Indian historical detective, so that is how Muzaffar Jung came about. So
right.
and what happened was that for Muzaffar Jung, I had to do so much research, into Mughal Delhi, that I ended up getting fascinated with history itself, and especially the history of Delhi. So I've lived in Delhi now since 1985. So that's
Okay.
most of my life has been spent in Delhi. And because of all the research I did for the Muzaffar Jung book, so I know a fair bit about Delhi now. So I thought
Hmm.
might as well go and do something about Delhi itself, which was how my latest, a series of books, which is called the Delhi Quartet, that came about. So that was it. That's the
Very
history of
interesting. I I really I mean you've taken us through, of course, how the fascination with whodunits or crime fiction
Hmm.
really attracted you. I think it started off for us pretty early. I mean, even with just the five find outers and dog or famous five, where they're actually solving small mysteries.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that fascination with
yeah.
the whodunits. Uh, for you, of course, it seems to have really taken hold of you and then allowed you to explore that genre of writing, and which I think is amazing. So yes, that makes absolute sense the way you explained that the entire journey that you've taken. But at this point, I just want to take a moment to welcome those who are joining us or who have joined us on this conversation. Welcome once again to all of you. This is our June edition of Humanity 2.0. And today we have a very, very interesting and intriguing personality writer with us, Madhulika Liddle. And she is going to be telling us a little bit more about all her writing. So stay tuned and please do drop in your questions if you have any, or even suggestions, and we'll make sure that Madhulika is able to answer them as well. So welcome to all those who have joined us right now. Since we are taking a short detour from where you are right now, historical fiction, which I know I've read one of your books, and I know I'm going to be reading many more of them. The whole concept of writing history or writing historical books which have history as its main theme at a time when it looks like history is kind of being either manipulated or forgotten or rewritten. How do you think your novel is going to take your novels? I mean, all your writing, the body of writing that you have. How do you think that is going to echo with the present times?
One of the things which I try to do when I'm writing historical fiction is to try and show things which people may not have thought about. So, for instance, just as an example, Hemu. You've heard of Hemu. Hemu was this man who, when Akbar was or crowned first, Humayun died in 1556, right? And Akbar was then about 13 years old, and Akbar was not in Delhi at the time when Humayun died. Akbar was away in Punjab. And what happened was that Hemu was this man who he had been a quite a powerful sort of wazir and general and all that. He started this campaign and he was the one who actually defeated Akbar's forces. And he was crowned king, right? Hemu was crowned king. And if you go to the net today, go and search for Hemu, on the
Okay.
net, and you will come up with these very biased sites which talk about Hemu being, the only Hindu king of medieval Delhi, and he was going to do Ram Raj and all sorts of things. It's a very sort of very hagiographical sort of thing. It's like sort of making him out to be some sort of hero. And the truth actually is that Hemu he was a general of the Afghans. He had been a general of the Afghans. He had served under the Afghans. And he was, when he actually went against Akbar, some of his greatest generals were Afghan generals. And so when later, when Hemu actually he was king for about a month or so. When he actually had his coronation, he had this Raja Abhishek, he rewarded his Afghan allies very richly. So people
Okay.
don't think about that. What people don't realize is that religion is not just religion. There's a lot of politics in it. What
Right.
the sort of nexus between Hemu and the Afghans is forgotten. People only remember that Hemu himself was a Hindu. They don't forget. They
Right.
don't realize. Most of the time they don't know. That is the
Right.
problem. If you're only looking at Google, Wikipedia, WhatsApp for your information, you might get a
Yes.
very warped, you might get a very warped
Perspective.
view, right?
You're right.
So
You're right.
that's what I try to do, because what is going. My feel is that a lot of people. I personally know people who say we don't read non-fiction, which means that they're not going to read so the books in which it is written that Hemu actually did this, right? And that Hemu is not the only one. That there are lots
Correct.
of
Yes.
other examples of a very syncretic, sort of society, or also a lot of examples of it not being quite so black and white.
Right.
Right now we get this impression that everything is like communities are in tight silos and there's no sort of interaction between them.
Interaction or
But
overlap. Right. Right.
yeah, there's lots of cultural overlaps, and it's not religion. Religion is just one of the things. So I hope that people who read my book, people who are, who can read fiction, who don't mind reading fiction, they're able to come away with something. They're able to learn something out of this because it's presented in an entertaining sort of way. So that's what I've tried to do
Absolutely.
in the first book also of the Delhi Quartet, which was the Garden of Heaven, where I've tried to
Yes.
show ways in which which people don't often think about. Even
Right.
if they know some bit of history, they don't think about that, or they just don't know it.
Exactly. So for our conversation today, I was actually thinking of parking on this book of yours,
Mm.
which is The Garden of Heaven. While its epic proportions enthrall the reader, the intricate details are so evocative that one can relate with all the characters: Madhav, Sridhar Sahu, Gayatri, Jayashree, Jalal, or even Shagaftu. How did this novel come about?
This actually happened because, again, a lot of my books have their roots in when I was a teenager. When I was
Okay.
a teenager, in my late teens, I was lent this book called Sorum. It's been written by somebody called Edward Rutherford. And
Okay.
Sorum is it's sort of set against the history of the town of Salisbury in England. Salisbury is home to the famous Salisbury Cathedral, right?
Right.
And this book, it stretches from the Ice Age to 1984. So it's this collection of stories. It is an epic saga of families who they date back from the Ice Age, and then all their stories are told all through those many thousands of years. So it's quite fascinating. And when I read it, I was like blown away. I said, "Wow, this is like that's one of the best historical fiction pieces I've read." And somewhere in that thing, I had this idea that okay, someday I must write something like this. And eventually, after, as I told you, I did all that research on Delhi. So I said, okay, we should try doing it for Delhi. So I didn't have the nerve to go back into ancient history, but I decided to do Delhi from the coming of Muhammad Ghori, which was in 1198,
Right.
onwards till partition. So that was where I decided that I should do this thing called the Delhi Quartet. I decided not to do just one book, but let's do 4 books, which will be a more manageable size. Instead of Sorum is a tome. It's
Oh,
like 5 inches across. So the first book was The Garden of Heaven, which is, it begins in 1198 and goes on till Timur's invasion.
right.
And That's how it
That's how
began.
it came about. Yes, so I mean, I read the book and I was enthralled, and I have to confess that I then passed it on to my dad to read it as well. So I'm sure he's reading it right now. So I mean, the characters I think are amazing. The way you have taken the time to let them mature over time as well. I love the fact that the characters and narratives are so seamlessly interwoven into the intricacies of the historical events and artifacts and personalities. So the Garden of Heaven also unfolds several themes, which I think are so resonant of our current times, whether it's displacement, migration, cultural and religious identities, prejudice, and discrimination. So, Madhulika, since you've read so much of history and you have a passion for history, and somehow history seems to have a pull on you, does history repeat itself? And are there ways we can change the narrative about some of these issues today?
I think history does repeat itself, and that is why, even though it sounds like a cliche, that thing, but that if you don't learn from history, you will be the loser for it. I think that actually, sort of works, for instance, what we are seeing in Israel these days, it's so heartbreaking that, this is what happened to the Jews. The sort of the way Hitler tyrannized the Jews, and the sort of the way Israelis are treating the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip. It's such a sad parallel, and nobody's learning anything from it. And unfortunately, that is what is going on. That is just one example. We're seeing things like that happening all across the world, all across India. There are so many examples of people not learning anything from history, not, and the sheer ignorance, I think, is what really is, it's really painful to see, that, and it's, I don't know, I get very emotional, and I think when I
Please,
realize
yeah, we'd love
the
to hear
amount of
what you're thinking about it.
the intolerance and the hatred which comes out of being ignorant and of refusing to even want to listen. That is the thing. You can be ignorant, but be open to hearing what somebody has to say. But the mere fact that you're shutting off you're closing your mind, that is, I think, the main problem. And there's actually, if you actually go into history, there's so much you can learn. For instance, right now I've been reading this book called The Jains. So it's an exploration of the community, its identity, and how it interacted, especially with the Mughals. And it is fascinating, because you hear about all these interesting things. For instance, Jain texts, religious texts, which are talking about Akbar as being the son of Ram, and saying that, oh, he is the embodiment of Ram and he has done so much for the country and people love him so much. And in fact, the author says that Akbar seems to have had a fan following among the Jains. Now, how many, and you have all this, the Mughal bashing going on these days, the flavor of the month. So, and you don't realize it's not just Akbar, but Jahangir and Shah Jahan and all also had very, very good relations with the Jains. Jahangir, of course, was a little unpredictable, but he did have very good relations. And of course, and you come to Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb, of course, is everybody's, sort of pet in noir. Everybody thinks Aurangzeb was seriously bigoted, and he was. But there are actually instances of Aurangzeb himself having donated land for a temple to be built. So that is the thing. If you learn this, if you understand this, then you realize also that perhaps the sort of other things which these people might have done, it's not completely bad. It's not Aurangzeb was a complete bigot. It's not that, uh, history has nuances. I think that is what people
I
need to
would agree.
understand.
Yes. Yes. But again, coming back to my question, like how are there ways? I mean, I'm not saying how, but are there ways we can change the narrative about some of these issues today? What could some of the ways be? And you, with your power of words and the power of writing, which I have always believed that the pen is mightier than the sword. We've heard it so often, especially when we were growing up. But the truth remains that what you write today can last longer than anything else does, right? I mean, because it has the power to change, it has the power to create, it has the power to destroy as well. So as a person with that kind of a power, what would you suggest? What could be some of the ways that we can rewrite or
You
the
know,
narrative?
one of the things I do is whenever in most of my writing, it's not just in this sort of writing, historical fiction, but in most of my writing over the years, initially I did write what would be called pure entertainment, but now I have over the past, I think, uh, past decade or past 7 or 8 years, I have started writing more mm, what propaganda. I don't know how to put it, but something which has a little message to it.
Right.
So, like for instance, as you yourself said about the Garden of Heaven, that there are uh, threads woven into it of things which are pertinent today as well. And I've done that in a lot of my other writings as well. For instance, there are short stories and all which I've written, and which are about, say, for instance, there's a short story I recently wrote, which was published in a collection. It's called A New Home for Bhesa. So it's about this little family which lives in a North Indian village in UP somewhere, and they've got a cow. They've got a black cow, whom they call Bhesa, and black cow. This family is Muslim, right? And they've got this black cow, and she is like, their pet. They adore her, and she's a milch cow. And what happens is that Bhesa becomes very old, and then they don't know what to do with her because, and this is actually based on some this is based on real life because my parents have friends who were Muslims and who had cows, and when the cows got old, they were in a flood because they said if anybody, if this cow dies on our hands, we've had it, we will be lynched. So this whole story is this. It's a humorous story. It's about this Muslim family who don't know what to do with this cow.
Right.
And they're very worried about her. They're very worried about her that, we don't want to desert her. And yet, what
We
will we
don't know
do
what to
there?
do with her. Yeah.
What do we do with her? And the whole story is about, that they find what sort of solution they find. And it's got a little twist in the tail. But,
Yeah.
if you don't have to go very deep into it to realize it's a satire. It's a
Right.
satire on how what we have done to ourselves, and that is the sort of thing which I'm doing quite a bit of in most of my writing. And I've chosen to do quite a bit of writing in sort of a humorous mode, where I try to sort of bring in satire
Yes.
and to sort of give a message.
I
So
read a quote recently which said that if you have to give them something which they need to think about, for heaven's sake, say it in a way that they can laugh about it as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
maybe that is one of the best ways, but it is not lost. The message is not lost because
Yeah,
I think it just makes it, it puts it in a way that we are able to take it. And maybe those of us who think will have the food for thought that is required. So I mean, I love the fact that you've woven humor into your writing because even with the Garden of Heaven, which is actually the only book of yours which I have read thus far, and I am looking forward to reading more. But I mean, there were so many times when I actually, laughed out loud to myself just with the way you made a situation which could have been, really a tense and hard situation. The way you expressed it was so light. And yet, of course, the message got through to me and to your readers, I'm sure. So, I mean, I'm so glad that you did answer that question in the best way that we are able to identify with your answer as well. So, Madhulikas, something also which struck a chord with me was the narrative in your book of how art, and in this case it was the stone carving, transcends the diverse rudiments of caste and creed and history and geography and ideologies. And it worked as a unifier, like a connector. And as an artist yourself, you have made a foray into several forms of writings, right? You've written short stories, long fiction, blogging. You've done nonfiction on several topics like travel and cinema and even food. And all of them are so different from one another, evolving, various styles. So as a writer, would it be fair for me to ask you, do you have a favorite style? And if you do, why? Why is it your favorite?
I don't know. I think I prefer to sort of be writing something which has a hint of history in it. I'm not very comfortable writing contemporary. So, like, for instance, my blog. My
Right.
blog is also about pre-70s cinema. So my blog is also not, that is also historical
Historical.
in that sense. So I'm most comfortable. In fact, many years ago when The Englishman's Cameo was being released, Kaveri Bamza had asked me, she said, is there anything in your life which is less than 50 years old? So I had to admit that yes, there's very little in my life that is, contemporary. So most of my writing is historic. In some sense, it is not in this age. I do write stuff which is contemporary, but I think the percentage of it is much lower.
Well, I think that's also beautiful because there is a truth in the fact that you're preserving something which there's a sense of preservation, right? When we are talking about history, it's about something that can be remembered and should be remembered in a particular way, or uh, as as something that people can relate to, even though it is not of the now, because life is fleeting, and the now is hardly the biggest measure of time. It's so small. So I love the fact that, I mean, the way you even said that everything that you look at is from a historical perspective. In fact, you even mentioned, I think in one of your other conversations, that um, even your food, the blog that you've done on food has a bit of history to it, because you brought in the whole historical angle to, a certain kind of food or dishes, or, so yes, I think that's a theme that runs through your writing, which I really love. Um, Most of us, actually, I mean, all of us who probably are from the same time frame as you, have grown up reading Agatha Christie's Poirot, or the inimitable Sherlock Holmes. You created Muzaffar Jung. How did you conjure him up? And do you see him featuring in more of your detective novels?
Uh, how I conjured up was a fajat. I can't actually say that there was a particular idea I had in mind. It was just that I think when sort of uh, the whole thing arose out of this wanting to do a Indian historical detective. And then what happened was that because I was staying in Delhi, and Delhi was the city I was most comfortable with, it had to be somebody set it. It had to be the setting had to be Delhi.
Yes,
And I chose Mughal Delhi just for the simple reason that there's a lot of research material freely available
right.
about
That's true.
the Mughals, and especially about Shah Jahan's age,
Right.
this area known as Shah Jahanabad. So it seemed obvious that I would have a Mughal detective set in around that time. But Muzaffar Jung's character itself is sort of there was nothing very particular I had in mind. In fact, he changed a bit because of my editor. My editor said that, why don't you should give him some sort of vice. It's like Sherlock Holmes has his cocaine. So you should give him a vice. So I didn't give him I did give him a really bad vice. I just made him addicted to coffee.
Hardly a vice. I think people would
It's hardly
rise up against it being called a vice.
But one thing which I did do, which is which is perhaps a reflection of Muzaffar Jung in me, or me in Muzaffar Jung, however you like to say it, in that is that Muzaffar Jung is a maverick. He is actually a 21st century man transposed into the 17th century. Because if you actually look at how Mughal nobility would have been like in the 17th century, they would not have been like Muzaffar. Muzaffar is this, he's very, he's very open in his, he has friendships with the most unsavory characters. For instance, one of his best friends is this boatman. And, he moves around in circles which are not particularly he is not very fashionable. And noblemen were very fashionable. They used to dress up and jewelry and all, which was uh, sort of rivals the noble women. And Muzaffar is not like that. And also, importantly, in his attitudes towards women. So, Muzaffar Jung, the first, second book, third book onwards, Muzaffar meets the woman who's going to be his wife, and he gets married to her at the end of the third book. And he marries her because, and he falls in love with her not because of her beauty or whatever, but more because of her character, her intellect. And he is like and she actively starts playing a part in his work in the fourth book, which is Crimson City. So his ability to give his wife that the respect due to her intelligence and nothing else. So that is again sort of, it's not 17th century Mughal. Actually, it's me. It's a reflection of me.
Okay.
So that is it.
Okay. So that brings me to another very, very poignant question that that's been on my mind since I read your book. So, as an exceptional storyteller yourself, how would you describe the role storytelling plays in our world today? Who do you think tells the stories, and who decides how they are told? And what are some of the stories which have the power to change or influence lives?
I it's very difficult to say who tells the stories, because I think those in power tell the stories, but the fact is that those in power, that they might wield different types of power, and they might be hidden behind layers. So you may not realize that the story is coming from somewhere further down the chain. The story may come to you directly from what you perceive as a friendly, sort of face or whatever. But the actual story, who originates that story, who thinks up that story, and who manipulates you, maybe someone totally different. It's like, you have that whole thing about Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty. Moriarty is sitting at so he's sitting at the center of the web. The web spreads around. So I always think of it as that, the same way that today the stories which are there are lots of stories happening, but which are the stories which spread, which are the stories which get repeated, and which get echoed. That is, uh, I think there's a sort of, I don't know, it's not a very pleasant, uh, sort of, it's, I think there's manipulation. But on the other hand, I think that is something which has always been happening. It's not new. It's not new to this setting. It's not new to this. It's not unique to our times. I think that is something which has been happening throughout. So, for instance, even if you look at just at the question of patriarchy, that is the whole setup of showing that women have a particular place. And even if you are sort of idolizing women and saying, oh, they are like they're nothing short of goddesses and they have to be put on a pedestal and worshipped. Now, this is all, the whole agenda is to put women in a place from which they themselves will not want to be dislodged after a while if they don't think, right? So I think all of these, there is this whole thing about being able to control other people through your mind, and thus through the stories you tell. So, uh,
So, yes, I'm sorry, continue.
no. I finished.
Okay. So I know, I know the conversations today um, highlight the fact that storytelling has power. Any storytelling has power, maybe also originates from power. How do we break through? How do we break through that? How do I put this? How do we break through what seemingly seems to be an invisible wall to get to the right places with the right message in the right way so that there is change? Because what we're looking for and what we're hoping that people who have the power to actually write stories and tell them in the right places will do is actually to bring change. So do you, as a storyteller, as an author, as a writer, and who have who has the benefit of being in places where maybe the normal human being would not get to go and speak up, do you think it's a responsibility that you carry on your shoulders, to be able to get the messages out there?
Definitely. That is one of the reasons I put them in my stories, and that I'm not afraid to talk about them. I have to, I so I wish I was braver, but yes, this is what I can do. This is what I can do. I can talk about what I don't like about what is going on, and what I think the truth should be, or at least not, even if it's not the truth, an alternative way of looking at things. No, it may not. I'm one of those people. I can never tell what is the truth and what is not the truth. I feel that there's always a bit of a blurring. We can't ever sort of set it out in black and white. But you should be open to understanding that and accepting that there could be another truth. Your truth may not be my truth. So I think that sort of the that tolerance and that broad-mindedness needs to be there, and that's what I've tried all along to sort of cultivate. And they're in my books, and I speak about them as whenever I get a chance to talk. I always talk about that. I always say that sort of open up, read stuff, and people who are storytellers, people who have influence, I think should speak up. They should,
Yes. And I think you did it very bravely, even in the Garden of Heaven. The way you've juxtaposed religious communities, the way you've juxtaposed like issues of power and powerlessness, the way you've juxtaposed so many of the relevant issues for today, like where there was misplacement, or people being uprooted from their cultural identities. You've beautifully looked at how those things can actually converge in a story like yours. The fact that they were not, like you said, not everything was black and white. Not everything is black and white. So I think you've done that very clearly in the Garden of Heaven, and I'm looking forward to actually seeing that being, like a thread across all your writings. And maybe the next time, if we have you on our show again, we can pick up this particular topic and actually talk about it, Madhulika. I do at this point of time want to take a few minutes just to say that there are a couple of questions. So we have a question from Shantanu Datta, who talks about, who says, please talk a little bit about your book released last month. That was one of the questions. The second one is from Kezia Prabhu. Ma'am, I'm in the 10th grade and reading has become my passion. Since I'm a beginner at reading, what are the genres you would suggest for me to begin with? And there's also a question from Shah Alam, who says, how much of writing, especially story writing, is inheritance from the genes?
Okay, so which one should I take first? Which one first question? I think somebody...
Shantanu Datta
about
asked,
my new book.
Yes, about your new book that was released last month. Yes.
Okay. My new book is called An Unholy Drought, and it is the second book in the Delhi Quartet. So it's the sequel to Garden of Heaven. and it takes up approximately from where the Garden of Heaven ended. The Garden of
And
Heaven ends at the invasion of Tembo,
right
and an unholy drought begins about 15 years after that,
after that.
15 or 16 years after that. And it goes up till the coronation of Akbar. So it's actually, and the coronation of Akbar was, it's quite a it was quite a tumultuous time, because not only was Akbar, he had to overthrow Hemu to get his throne back, but
Yes.
also before that, Humayun had spent most of his life wandering around. He was so about 15 years of his life, 10 years of his life, he wandered around Persia and stuff like that, because Sher Shah Suri had kicked him out. And so it was a very tumultuous sort of period. And after Humayun died, Humayun fell down the stairs or fell from the roof or whatever at Delhi and died. And
Right.
it just, it struck me that, this might have been quite a bad time for people in Delhi who would not have known what was happening.
Correct.
And at the same time, there was a really bad drought all across northwestern India. And that is where the book takes its name from. It was a really bad drought. In fact, there are cases of cannibalism and all which were documented.
Wow, my
So
goodness.
my story, yeah, it's quite bad. So my story goes from like the early 1400s up to 1556. So it's about 150 years, and it's like the Garden of Heaven talks about this family of stone carvers. So an unholy drought has somebody who sets up a brocade factory, a brocade workshop. It's a woman.
Wow.
So she sets up a brocade workshop, and how the brocade workshop, it sort of it gets passed on through the generations. And there's one of the men, he's like, he inherits the workshop, but his heart and soul lie in calligraphy. Calligraphy is his passion. And how he has to then balance that, he's having to sort of figure out whether he should, sort of do his duty by his family by looking after the workshop, or he should sort of
Pick up
pursue
his
his
own
passion.
passion.
So
Yes.
there are other
Yeah.
dilemmas like this across the generations. And of course, there's history happening in the background. So there's, the Lodhis come to the throne, then Babur starts trying to get into India. So all of that happens in the background. So that's what an unholy drought is all about. Okay.
Yes.
Then we have the second question.
Yes,
The
the genres of
if
books
you're in
that you
class
would
10.
suggest. Yes.
Okay. I would not suggest starting with particular genres. I would suggest starting with particular authors. The authors I used to like really when I was young. Ruskin Bond is a firm favorite of mine.
Yes.
I love Ruskin Bond. He's like, he's so easy to relate to, no
Relatable,
matter what
yes.
age. He's very easy to relate to, and he's like, he is one person whom I always admire for the fact that his English is not, it's not very, very complicated. It's simple English, it's simple, but at the same time, it's very refined. And I aspire to write like Ruskin Bond does. So I would definitely say start with someone, you should start with people like Ruskin Bond. Among other writers, since I am like a fan of historical and detective and all that, so I'm not sure how much you would want to read all of those, but you could try reading Jude House, you should like. Or Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is great fun to read. And especially, if you look for some of the more popular books, you have things
Yes.
like, and then there were none, and Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Yeah, I think that would be a good place to start. And what happens is that once you read one book by one author, you might say, okay, I like this, so let me go on. So
Right.
that could be, I think.
Great suggestions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And what was our third question? The
third question was how much of writing or especially story writing is inheritance? Yes, from the genes.
I don't think so. I don't think any actually, because I think a love for words is something I've inherited from my mother. My mother has been like, she did her MA in English. So when I was very young, and my mother did her MA when I was a kid, you know. So what happened was that she done her BA when she was before she got married. And then long after she got married, she decided, okay, now I'll do my MA. So she did her MA when I was, I think, 5 or 6 years old. And what I would do was that she would have her notes spread out everywhere. And one day, I think she went out somewhere and her books were lying at home. When she came back, she found that I had copied out on 2 whole pages. I thought the whole point of
Wow.
taking notes was to copy down everything that was written on the page. So I think my love for words comes from my mother. But other than that, not really. My sister's fascination with history is sort of transmitted itself to me, but I'm not sure that was a sort of genetic thing happening there. It was simply proximity. So my sister's nearby, and she was like sort of raving about all these historical facts she'd learned. So somewhere that affected me as well. But no, the storytelling is
Your own.
not inherited, not
Yeah.
inherited at all.
Storytelling is your own then, Madhulika. I can't
Yeah.
believe that we're almost up with our hour. I didn't realize that time was flying by so fast. But honestly, it has been such a interesting and intriguing conversation, Madhulika. Thank you so much for actually taking the time out. And I know there's just so much more I would love to have this conversation with you about. And let's see whether we can have a sequel so that we can discuss some of your other writing as well, which I think is equally enthralling. So just before we end, I did also want to just thank all those who have joined us on this call today and listened to to people talking. I know, but I hope we've given you some food for thought, and I hope that you will pick up Madhulika's books. There are quite a few available. I know that since I got mine on Amazon, I know that they are available on Amazon, and so I encourage you to take a trip down memory lane, or rather just trip down history, the lane of history, to be able to understand a little bit more and see how beautifully she has woven a story, taking historical facts and artifacts. So please do that. Thank you for those who shared questions. Please keep them coming. We'll try to see the best way that Madhulika can continue to answer those questions as well. So once again, thank you so much for being on the show with us, Madhulika. But before we end, I wanted to ask you, would you be able to share with us some of the projects that you're working on right now?
I do have another book which is going to become probably sometime next year. It's another historical detective,
Okay.
and that is set in the Indus Valley civilization.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
I
So
mean,
I really wanted to do.
yes, it took me back to school for a moment. The Indus Valley civilization.
So yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that would be absolutely interesting.
So
Right.
that is one thing which is coming up, and of course, I'm working on the sequel to an Unholy Drought. So right now, I'm doing mostly research,
Okay.
but that is also happening. And yeah, there is of course there's another book which is probably also going to come up maybe sometime next year, which is it's a rom-com, so a romantic comedy, which is a
That's quite.
contemporary novel.
Yeah, that sounds so unlike
So
you, actually.
yeah. So
It will be
yeah,
interesting to read.
yeah. So I'm pretty eclectic that way.
That's lovely. That's really lovely. And like I said, I'm looking forward to reading a few more of your books. So the next conversation we have, we'd probably then, move from book to book or, different style of writing. So thank you once again very, very much for being with us on this evening's talk show, Madhulika. Really appreciate that. Thank you once again, everyone, for being with us. We appreciate it. Please do log in again next month for another edition of Humanity 2.0 Conversations.
Thank you so much, Prashanti, and thank you everybody who's come. Thank you so much.